just to give you a bit more about my background, as the sheriff pointed out, I have a fair number of credentials. I've written lots of papers. I've mentored many students and led large teams. So at NASA, I had a team of 75 people, scientists working for me. At the university, I had teams of 15 or 20 students and postdocs doing research. So I've been able to work in some pretty diverse agendas. I've also had opportunities to work with the private sector. So I've worked in helping to develop water resources in Africa and the Middle East. So I've had quite a bit of international exposure as well. So let me tell you about reclamation. So I was the senior scientist, essentially the science advisor for reclamation. I was the only scientist in the DC office. So reclamation, as you know, mostly works in the West. And I was one of 70 people east of the Mississippi working in the DC office and the only scientist there. I was hired to advise the commissioner on science issues. I was also hired to be the scientific integrity officer. So it was a new position that they asked me to write policy about scientific integrity and how to enforce that, also to educate people about scientific integrity. And then I was also in charge of peer review, which is a way of checking science, as well as data stewardship as a way of making sure that the government takes good care of the data it collects and makes that freely available and easily available to the entire community to double check their work. So I started in April 2011, and everything went fairly well. I had a number of tours and trips trying to learn the role and try to get the understand what all the different projects of reclamation do. And it's a pretty vast organization, 5,000 employees spread across the western United States. One of those trips brought me to this region, so I spent some time in Northern California. I toured all the dams that are slated for removal on the Klamath River. I went on a tour with reclamation scientists as well as Pacific Corps scientists, and I felt I got a pretty good idea, kind of an insider's view of what the science really was from the grassroots level within the organization. I also reviewed quite a few documents. Read some of the reports of the panels that met to review science last summer. And I also got exposure to other rivers with similar issues. So I visited Trinity and the San Joaquin, as well as the Colorado, and quite a few others that are engaged in different aspects of river restoration. So that's essentially who I am and how I got to September 15th of 2011. So on September 15th, 2011, I was sitting in my office minding my own business when a press officer, a relatively low-level press officer, came to my office and said, I have this press release that I just have a big concern about scientifically, and I'd like you to take a look at it. So I took a look at it, and based on what I knew about the Klamath, it was completely unacceptable. It raised all kinds of red flags with me about how optimistic it was. It was essentially titled, removing the Klamath dams will have great economic benefits for society and create all kinds of jobs and do great things for the fish. So that wasn't my understanding. My understanding was there was all kinds of uncertainty in the science, and that there was a lot of unknowns, a lot of things we didn't know, and a lot of risks in taking those dams out. So I complained. I said to the press officer, I said, I think we have a problem here. She brought it to her boss, and I went with her. Her boss said, this was the press officer for reclamation, and he said, this is above my pay level. This is not a press release that we wrote. And so he asked me to bring it to a higher level. So I brought it to the press secretary of the Department of Interior, and he had an interesting response. He said, I don't want you to email this to me, your concern. I want you to give me a hard copy, but I don't want you to create discoverable documents. Essentially documents that are discoverable under the Freedom of Information Act. And that really struck me as dishonest and not in the nature of what my job was or what I should be doing as a servant of the U.S. citizens. I was under the understanding that we should do everything transparently and in public trust. So this really struck me strangely. I also talked with the Office of the Solicitor, which is basically the lawyers that, it turns out this article and the summary of science that I was reviewing was written by the Solicitor's Office, the group of the government that kind of is lawyers to defend the government. So what I was reviewing was a press release, like I described, but it also had a summary of science findings that was attached to it. That wasn't going to go out in the press release, but had a big title at the top, Secretarial Decision Process, and it really appeared that it was a summary for the Secretary and the public of here's what the science says. And it said a number of things that were just didn't seem right to me, so I didn't go through those. I'm going to refer to my notes slightly here. So the first thing that it talked about was that the summary said Chinook salmon recovery is projected at 81.4%. I was concerned about that number, first of all, because there's so many unknowns and so many uncertainties. How can you get 81.4%? Why not 81.3%? If I got that answer on a test from my students at my university, they wouldn't get a very good grade, because they would know that that implies a very high precision and certainty in that number. Even if I had seen 80%, I would be surprised. I think the number, at this point, I would be amazed to see that it's more than likely that there'll be an increase in Chinook salmon. But 81.4% is pretty amazing. It turns out that Nature magazine, Scientific American, looked into this and wrote an article about this number recently, and found that it's based on an unpublished report, peer-reviewed report, that was released the same day as this press release. And it said that the uncertainty was somewhere around 800%. So